Hey guys, in this video I'm going to be discussing and demonstrating my process of painting a portrait, specifically painting an Alla Prima styled portrait, otherwise known as direct painting. But let's just get straight to it. So over here I have the reference I'll be using, and on top here we have my artist's references or painting references. From left to right we have an unfinished Sargent, a Velasquez, a finished Sargent, a Franz Hals, and of course, lastly, a Zorn. And it's so important that whenever it is you're painting or drawing, that you have your favorite paintings or drawings by your favorite artists. These will not only help influence your work, but also answer the questions you might have at certain points throughout painting. Anyway, let's get straight to the video. So we're starting the drawing now, and I knew I wanted to keep it quite loose and allow it to be simply a suggestion that I can later build off of or on top of. I wasn't entirely successful, though, with how I wanted this drawing stage to look. Because if you look at the second painting in my artist's references, second from the left, I wanted to incorporate Velázquez's bold and direct or assertive brushwork in his drawing of the lady's shirt. But I guess I just forgot about that and just kept it loose. But I think it's great that I'm able to acknowledge that as I'm watching this over. And again, that's why it's so important to not only have these artist references near when painting or drawing, and to, of course, not forget about them. They're there to take inspiration from and to better, in this case, my work. The certain things I enjoy about their paintings. When drawing, I recommend that you slow down, even though I'm just eyeballing it in terms of measurements. And oh, by the way, before I even started drawing, I took and placed the essential landmarks of the reference, or of the head. The landmarks being the top of the head, the bottom of the chin, and the sides of the head. Very important. And these are the only accurate measurements I take or have taken at this point. Like I said while I'm drawing now, I'm simply eyeballing the placement of features. Also in drawing, flip your canvas or your painting like how you would utilize and view your painting through mirror when working traditionally. It flips the image, allowing you to see and spot mistakes since our eyes become tired or strained, therefore loses that ability to spot mistakes, if that makes sense. You'll see right about now, I lay in the base tone for the painting in terms of the background. Now, this is something I would have done before drawing, but it seems I just wanted to get started. And speaking of, I always paint in one layer, all of the drawing, background, and the actual painting of the head I do all in one layer. This was just a different case now because I already started with the drawing and had to make a new layer to create the background, but I then simply merged the two layers together and now I'll be painting without adding or moving layers. So I have my landmarks layer and my actual painting layer. These I keep separate so that I can place the landmarks on top of the painting to ensure that I don't paint past them. And I'm sure, as you would have seen, I have multiple layers, but those are just that brown background behind everything, and another group of layers include my references. Now, I also have my canvas layer and a duplicate of that canvas that I lay over the top of the painting, but all of this, as well as the brushes I use, I'll go over a bit later in the video. I've started the block-in of my painting. And at this stage, I'm following my drawing in terms of not measuring, again, simply eyeballing the placements. And very soon I'll begin to actually take measurements and you'll see the somewhat drastic changes that will be made. So just carefully laying down the lights of the head now, not paying attention to any shifts in tonal values, ignoring the highlights, etc. Always paying attention to Sargent's block-in, and later on, you'll see how I develop the block-in further. But it's best to work simple to complex. And I recommend when you're painting that you always try to control what you're doing. Make sure that you always set yourself up for success. There's nothing like being completely discouraged with the painting at any given point throughout the process until you just start slapping paint about without any real reason or purpose. So even before you see yourself feeling that way or getting to that point, like there's no hope, just stop and assess what's the best way to move forward. Take back control of the process. I don't believe the painting should control you. Yes, you can get completely caught up in the process of working, but always be in control. You'll see that I've zoomed in now, and when you're working, it's best that you work as far away from the painting as possible, or keep the painting at a distance. In traditional, you'd constantly walk back and forth from your painting, and we know very well that these artists above would have tired their legs out, pacing up and down from their easels. This is best when wanting your work to look and feel looser. Typically, you would work one-to-one, having your painting and the model or reference side by side. I keep my colors at this point somewhat subdued, just focusing on separating the lights from the darks, laying down an average for all the darks, and an average for all the lights. For this block-in, I am also referencing that unfinished Sargent above, the one on the left. I'm not too sure why it was left unfinished, but I think it's great that we're able to have something like this that can help aid us artists when trying to better understand our favorite artist's process of painting. So I'm looking at how bold or large he's laid down his shapes, what areas are more thicker, what areas are thinly applied, and so forth. Again, I'm not trying to paint exactly like these artists, just trying to take inspiration from them. Since we are attempting an alla prima approach to painting, why wouldn't you reference the greats and masters of this painting style? You would have seen how I've moved the mouth and the bottom of the nose up. These were the changes, among others, that were made. For measuring, I actually use a handheld compass that I would hold up to the reference, measuring the certain distances from my landmarks. These measurements, I would then compare to my painting, adjusting and fixing where needed. For example, with the mouth, as soon as I measured from the bottom of the chin to the top of the upper lip, I realized that what I had painted was very much incorrect. So I made those corrections. Also very important to note is, whenever you're fixing the drawing or the placement of things, other things also become affected. When I moved the mouth up, the distance or the gap between the mouth and nose became smaller. Therefore, of course, the nose also had to be adjusted. And to check that size of that distance, again, I just measured the distance from the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the chin. Remember, the chin we already identified as being an immovable landmark. Now, we begin refining the block-in, starting with the hair. And I try to be as close and accurate with my color and value choices now, paying much more close attention to temperature, but still working from simple to complex. In this stage, we're not modeling the form as much as we will be doing later. simply setting up a more reliable foundation to model on top of. When I talk about modeling, I'm referring to refining the forms of the head convincingly, turning the form. Now, the drawing, or the construction or measuring, is the most important part of any painting. We're constantly drawing and measuring. I cannot state this point enough. It is so important, especially when painting the head. We're never not drawing, we're never not measuring. Another key fundamental alongside drawing are the values. The tonal values are a spectrum from light to dark, white being the lightest value, and of course, black being the darkest. But depending on the lighting, not everything you paint will have a lightest light or a darkest dark. Pay attention to what you're looking at. Anything we observe looks like that thing not only because of the drawing, but because of the values. For example, if you were to take and flip an image of a blanket into black and white, we're still able to make out that it is a blanket. This is because a blanket can be constructed or drawn a certain way, and because of the lighting, the tonal values help depict not only the folds but also the texture. The same can be applied to the head. This head can be drawn a particular way, and its values help describe its forms moving towards or away from the light. I can go on and fill an entire video talking about values and even drawing, but I hope this basic analogy is helpful. But this becomes a lot more complex to see and understand once color is thrown into the mix. Because color also has its own value. It's a lot, I know. If someone says painting is not difficult, they simply do not get it yet. But once you're able to fully understand and apply these fundamentals correctly, the results will speak volumes. I know this was probably a terminology overload, but they're so important. It's what makes representational painting. So back to the process. Really popping those warm and hot reds on the ear, slowly moving the painting forward. Also, even though this is an Alla Prima painting, take breaks. Step back away from the painting and assess your work so far alongside your reference. Another point I forgot to include earlier is that I'm also flipping my screen into black and white. This again helps me get not only a different perspective, but also helps me evaluate the values. Another way to assess values is by squinting at your reference. Squinting allows you to remove the details and focus on the larger overall image. It's all about the context as a whole. Details can be important, but at this stage, it's pretty irrelevant. Pushing the painting along now, indicating the highlights. I've still left majority of shadows the same. The idea behind this is because I want a lot of the attention to be on the lights and allowing the shadows to fall out of focus. It's more an aesthetic choice. I'm laying down now a much more accurate depiction of the lights. paying closer attention to the color as well. Again, I've kept the colors, and even the values up to this point, subdued. And I'm not saying that this was actually intentional, but it's something I constantly find myself doing. And I think this is because when we start fresh, we need to build up a context. And it's only once we have a more convincing context to judge that we can improve on it. This stage could be the so-called ugly stage of a painting. So when starting a painting and comparing colors that we mix with the reference, we're not entirely sure if it's correct. We can mix colors on our palette to the best of our ability, but the final test is placing it on the canvas or paper. We will only know whether or not our color or value choices are correct once the head is somewhat formed, like seen here. And when working digital, I seriously do not recommend just color picking from the reference. Try your best to analyze and make an educated decision when mixing or choosing a color from the color wheel. I'm going to speed up the process now a bit more just so that we can get into the modeling stage. All I'm doing is just refining the block in with more accurate colors. Now we can finally start the modeling. But this does not mean detailing. You'll see that I haven't even indicated the eyes up until this point. That's because the eyes are dramatically cast in shadow. So when you squint at the reference, the eyes almost disappear in the shadows. Also, I didn't think it was necessary to indicate them during the block-in, because I had the confidence and trusted my drawing ability to place them during this stage. I've also switched brushes, and very soon I'll go over the brushes and layers I use when painting. This is the time when I pay extra close attention to the full range of values and their respective colors. Still using my compass to take and compare measurements. Even while I'm working, I'm not losing sight of the whole. Asking myself, how does this eye sit within the whole of the head? You'll see the painting doesn't move much right now because of these smaller shapes I'm placing in. But always trust your ability and your painting process. Because these are smaller forms, they can also be much more difficult to measure accurately. So it's important that you take larger measurements instead of small ones, and utilize your landmarks. Because that eye socket on the right is so dark, I first just placed a block of dark and built on top of that. I'm really exaggerating some temperatures here. I'm placing really warm notes around specific forms like straight cadmium reds or oranges. This is another artistic choice. but I know that I overdid it in certain areas, and I go over this during a self-critiquing part of the video at the end. I'm going to go over the brushes I use in the video as well as how to achieve a canvas texture. Firstly, the painting program I'm using is Krita. Basically, it's a free version of Photoshop. I've used both Krita and Photoshop. And when it comes down to the features, I can say without a doubt that there is very little to differentiate between the two. However, the brush engines are very different. So trying to replicate brushes from one software to another can take a bit of trial and error. I'll provide these brushes as a pack. If you've used Krita, you'll notice that these are actually the stock brushes that comes with the software. I've only made a few adjustments to them. But let's start from the left, with this one. I call this my dry brushing, number 2 brush. This is a brush I've actually made. I use this to place large shapes and to cover areas quicker, while still retaining a bit of a textural effect. I use this on the background and the chest of the figure when painting. Next is my dry bristles brush. This is one I do majority, if not all, of the block-in with. I just like the overall flat or filbert-like shape it creates, and of course its painterly texture. This is my dry brushing, number 1 brush. I use this brush for drawing and for scumbling. I use both of the dry brushing brushes for adjusting edges. Next, my modeling brush. Krita calls this brush dry textured creases. I love this brush because of its shape. When you flick your pen in certain directions, it produces a beautiful edge to the stroke. Look at that. Probably my favorite brush. I think it's very important that you don't spend all of your time looking for and downloading brushes. Trust me, majority of the brushes out there do pretty much the same thing. I've ended up spending more time actually messing around with brushes than actually painting, so I'd limit the selection of brushes to about 3 or 4. I also have this blender brush to soften edges, but don't overblend your work. This has to be used sparingly. I believe if majority of the areas in a painting are just softened, it loses its sense of strength. For the canvas, I typically just use a free stock image of canvas or paper. You can find these all over the internet, but I'll provide you with some. The canvas I'm using here was provided by the artist Jarod Erwin. I also utilized his demonstrations on painting like Sargent and Schmidt for inspiration when making this video. He's got some great insights. Anyway, I'd crop the canvas down to an appropriate size for my painting. Then I simply duplicate this layer and set it to grain extract. You could also set it to multiply. I then increase the contrast and invert it. This provides a much more textural image. The opacity then has to be dropped. I drop it down to about 8%. And that's about it. I hope this was all useful. Let's get back to the painting. Placing larger shapes in the forehead, trying to better depict that form. We've covered some of the basics when it comes to picture making, but another important one is edges. There are soft and hard edges. Other than composition, we can use edges to guide the viewer's attention. For example, because eyes tend to be a focal point when viewing portraiture, we can make the edges around this area hard. And on the edge of the hair, we can soften the edge, not only to make the hair more believable, but also to push it away from our focus. The edges of shadows can also be kept soft, and the areas in the lights we can harden. This is something that can be overdone, so be careful when wanting to make these decisions. Edges is a whole video's worth of information, and there are so many more ways to create or manipulate an edge in painting, so I'll just leave it there for now. I'm moving form to form during this stage, unlike the block-in where we constantly moved around the painting. The foundation has been laid in, so now we're able to focus on forms side by side. I think it's also easier to work this way because we can then relate accurate color values next to each other, but still always focusing on the whole. I'm placing the highlights in the hair now. With hair, I never want to attract too much attention, so I keep it quite loose. And because it's hair, this looseness works. When treating the hairline, I'm constantly flipping my image into black and white. It's easy to think that shadows are darker than what they actually are. So again, always utilize different tools to help you when working. Some more fundamentals. When it comes to painting the head, it can be separated into three color zones. The forehead is typically more yellow in color. The eyes, nose, and cheek regions can be more red or pink. This is because of the blood being much closer to the surface. And lastly, the chin, jaw, and mouth area tend to be more cool or greenish in color. This could be more obvious with men rather than women, indicating some stubble. You can even see it here in the reference. In my opinion, color is tertiary when it comes to the hierarchy of painting. Drawing being the most important, then values, and then color. So you can exaggerate color in your paintings. But there is such a thing as color harmony. This painting is predominantly warm because of the palette I've used. In both traditional and digital, I use a limited portrait palette. This can also be referred to as the Zorn palette. Anyway, since this painting is so warm, if I just started slapping vibrant blues and purples in certain areas, there would be an imbalance in color harmony. We're nearing the end of the video now, and I'm just left with the modeling of the mouth area and the chest. Ears are not really my favorite thing to paint. I always leave them to the end, like everything else. They are important. So even if you paint them loosely like I have here, do so convincingly. I like to keep the edges of the painting or background quite bold with expressive brushwork. Because the shapes in the portrait are smaller, I like to leave large and dramatic brushwork around the head. For example, I let those brush marks in the chest swoosh right into the background on the left side. Not getting caught up in having to paint inside the so-called lines. Again, another artistic choice. I want the picture to be expressive and not your typical head and shoulders painting. This is the finished painting, and I think it's fairly successful. As artists, we're constantly creating, so we have to treat these things as just paintings. There'll be many more to come, so we have to prioritize self-critiquing our work now. I know that I could have improved things like the drawing. I could have made the mouth area a bit fuller. the accuracy of my color choices, my drastic and dramatic temperature choices, etc. What I am quite happy with, though, is how warm the head came out. That's something I wanted to achieve. Another thing is the design of the picture. I'm quite pleased with that. But I really hope this video was helpful and insightful and even inspiring. There'll definitely be more to come. It would be great to know your guys' thoughts and comments. That's it from me. Stay in the paint.